Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk. This week I talk with Joel Glaser, the CEO of Ampers, a group of diverse community radio stations across Minnesota. We talk about how this group serves the underserved communities statewide, how he found his way to nonprofit media, and the difference between public radio and community radio on this week's Who the Folk podcast. But before we hear from Joel, programming is supported by Temple Israel, inspiring Jewish wisdom to help improve an ever-changing world. Register your children for the upcoming religious school year or find out more about their early childhood center, membership information, and more at templeisrael.com/learn-more. And be sure to check out the refreshed TC Jewfolk merch store with newly designed stickers, shirts, hats, and tote bags that help support our mission at Jewfolk and help you look fun and stylish. Check it out at tcjewfolk.com/store. Joel Glaser, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
No, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So, Joel, you are the Chief Executive Officer of Ampers, which is a nonprofit radio group in Minnesota. A group, is that the right sort of word for it?
You know, that's actually a great word. I should probably use that word more, honestly. We always say we're an association and we're kind of a trade association is often how we will explain ourselves, and have to very quickly explain that we are an association, not a network, because in radio, when you have a group of radio stations, there's a very quick assumption that it's going to be a network. And with a network, they are typically all carrying the same programming. And one of the things that really sets us apart is the fact that all of our stations are completely independent, and they are programmed by and for their local community. I used to have to say, if you could listen to our Grand Marais station and our Thief River Falls or our Winona station, I don't have to say magic anymore, but I've been here long enough that before I had to say magically. Now you can stream them, listen to them at the same time. But you'll be hearing very different things because you're hearing what's being programmed for Grand Marais and what's being programmed for Winona. So we have 8 different smaller, I often will refer to as kind of hyper local community stations. The one way we will explain is we're pretty much all the public radio stations, because we are public. We refer to ourselves as community, but we're all the public radio stations pretty much, anyway, that are not Minnesota Public Radio. And they're kind of the big box store, not in a bad way. I shop at Target and Home Depot, but they're at Target and Home Depot. We're the corner drugstore and hardware store, and I shop there too. But we're the corner drugstore, corner hardware store, primarily serving underserved communities. And then we define underserved as what is now considered BIPOC, but we were serving BIPOC long before BIPOC was ever an acronym. So we will reluctantly say BIPOC, but we don't, because everybody's serving BIPOC now, but we've been diverse. Our tagline is diverse radio for Minnesota's communities. And we have been diverse radio for Minnesota's communities for decades. So we serve BIPOC, members of the LGBTQIA2S plus community, those living with a disability. And then in Minnesota, there's really the Twin Cities and everything else.
Yes, there is.
And 14 of our 18 stations are outside of the metro. So we consider greater Minnesota to also be underserved when we talk about underserved and underrepresented and having voices that are not necessarily being heard. We also include greater Minnesota to be considered underserved. So BIPOC, the GLBTQ, those living with a disability, and greater Minnesota. And it's not that we exclusively serve those, but that is really the emphasis, and really kind of what sets us apart is our stations are serving communities that are not served in traditional media. So here in the Twin Cities, KMOJ, Jazz 88, Radio K at the University of Minnesota, and KFAI, Fresh Air Radio. And we have a total of 18 stations throughout the state that get as far north as Canada and as far south as the Iowa border, and just about everything in between. 4 of them are actually licensed to Native American tribes, primarily in northern Minnesota. We've got Fond du Lac, Leech Lake, Bois Forte, and White Earth all have their own radio stations that we help to support.
That's fantastic. And if I'm taking a look at the coverage map, and anybody else is welcome to go to the ampers.org website and do that. You really do cover really, with the exception of the southwest chunk of piece of the state, the stations really do cover a large swath of Minnesota.
And people will say, well, what's going on down there? And it's a really good. I think the answer is what's going on down there. We don't build community stations. We support stations that already exist, and for whatever reason, there are not community stations down there. And if you look at the population map, honestly, there's Worthington. There's just not that many cities down there. So they're just, for whatever reason, nobody ever decided. So our stations they're either licensed to, so AMPER is actually the acronym is the Association of Minnesota Public Educational Radio Stations. It's more than a mouthful, which is why we go by AMPERS.
Yes.
My lobbyists could not get that right for like 5 years. I had to keep correcting them. But the reason it's public educational radio stations is the majority of them initially were licensed to college, schools, or university. So like Jazz 88 is licensed to Minneapolis Public Schools. Our St. Cloud station is licensed to St. Cloud State University. Mankato is licensed to Minnesota State Mankato. So they're either licensed to a college, school, or university. A community themselves. So here in the Twin Cities, KMOJ is licensed to the community. There's a nonprofit in North Minneapolis that created, the community created a nonprofit to have a radio station. Same with Fresh Air Radio, same with up in Cook County for Grand Marais. Same is true Northern Community Radio for Grand Rapids and Bemidji area. So it can be licensed to the community itself, or it can be licensed to a tribal government. So either a college, school, or university, the community itself, or a tribal government. And then we support them. And that's another 5-minute answer of what do we do for them? And we'll hold that off here for a second.
So it's like I grew up in Michigan. I did a semester of doing sports reporting for the college radio station at Michigan State. So like college radio is been like a sort of known quantity, if you will, for a really long time. I don't think quite enough gets made of the fact that there is that Jazz 88 is run out of North High School in Minneapolis, that it is licensed to like you said, Minneapolis Public Schools. That is exceptionally cool. How rare is something like that?
Well, first of all, Minnesota is rare in that we have Minnesota Public Radio, and then we have this group of independent community radio stations. That is incredibly rare. So if you go to Iowa, pretty much any public radio is going to be part of Iowa Public Radio.
Okay.
If you go to the Dakotas, it's North Dakota or Prairie Public Radio, and they're all a part of just the state network. You may have a single station here or there, and we do have a couple of stations. Like Bemidji State has a station that is not a part of AMPERS, and part of that is because they go dark during the summer when the students are off. And so they don't qualify for state funding, but so we're unique in that we have and have been able to support these smaller community radio stations, which typically it would be an either or. You'd either have NPR, because NPR has repeaters. So if you go up to Duluth or if you go up to Grand Marais, you can listen to NPR and you can listen to all three NPR. But the difference is they're taking their programming from the Twin Cities and then sending that Twin Cities programming statewide.
Right.
Then if there's something going on really, really, really big in Grand Marais, you might hear a minute and a half about it because the people in the Twin Cities don't want to hear more than a minute and a half about it.
That's right.
But the people up in Grand Marais do. So
Okay.
our Grand Marais station may go on for 20 minutes about it because it may be a forest fire that is heading their direction, and they want to hear from emergency services about what streets are being closed down and what's going to be closed down next, and et cetera, that is way too granular for the station in the Twin Cities. So you've got NPR taking it and sending it from what I call the mothership, with a beautiful state-of-the-art facility. Yes, there's a little bit of jealousy with the amount of money that they bring in, but that's fine. And then we have our smaller stations throughout the state. And I should clarify that while they are licensed to a college, school, or university, and Jazz 8 is a perfect example, most people, unless they're really listening with a critical ear or really paying attention to every now and then they hear a student on for school news, it is not a Minneapolis public school station or what you think of a college radio station.
Got it. Okay.
I went to the University of Missouri, Columbia, and we had two radio stations. There was the college radio station, which is where everybody had their fun. It was in the basement, and we could play whatever we want, and it was a free for all. And we have one station and one station only. KUMM in Morris is a student-run college radio station. They are not eligible for state funding. I wouldn't be surprised here if they end up leaving our organization for some technical reasons.
Okay.
But our other stations that are affiliated with a college, school, university, there may be some opportunities, and maybe like at 9 or 10 o'clock at night, it kind of becomes a little bit of a college station. But if you listen during the day, it is much more of what you would expect of a traditional professional radio station, not somebody playing radio in their basement.
Got it. So is your background in, because Ampers is a nonprofit, is it sort of nonprofit management, or is your background out of, you're a broadcaster by trade?
I am a broadcaster by trade. So I went to the University of Missouri, Columbia for their School of Journalism, went through their broadcasting sequence. So they own the NBC affiliate there. So you actually get to work at the TV station and create and do reports and newscasts and produce and all of that. And so I actually started in TV, worked as a reporter, producer, executive producer, and I moved 5 times in 4 years. And they were always opportunities to go to better markets, but it was, I came back here to the Twin Cities briefly to do satellite news for Hubbard Broadcasting, but I produced the 6 o'clock news in Kearney, Nebraska. I went from Kearney, I went to Birmingham, Alabama, which I was not even welcome in the Jewish community in Birmingham. That's a whole nother, going to do a whole nother podcast on that. And from Birmingham, I went to Peoria, Illinois, where I went back to a smaller market to go up in management and became the executive producer. And I was like, I love this. And I have an opportunity to be a news director in Rockford, but I am so tired of moving. Like, we didn't put things on the wall because you wanted your damage by the back. And
right.
You knew you're going to move in another year. And so I was like, maybe I'll switch to sales. My father was like, you're missing your calling in sales. And I was like, Herb Tarler, used car salesman. Like, ooh, yuck. I've got ethics. I don't want to do that. That's yucky. And discovered you could have ethics and morals and take more of a teaching approach in sales. So I went to Kansas City because I wasn't quite ready to move back home, and switched to the evil dark side of sales and sold there for 6 years. Came up here, worked for Hubbard Broadcasting very briefly for AM 1500, became the sales manager trainer for KS95 and AM 1500, and then the sales manager of what is now My Talk, what was then FM 107. Very, very brief stint at Love 105 and KQRS. And I've actually been at Ampers now, it'll be 15 years in February, which in the broadcast world, I'm a dinosaur. It is more than twice of any place else I have ever been. I took it thinking it was a job, not a career. But we have grown leaps and bounds. When I got here, I was the only person, with the exception of a part-time lobbyist, and we had revenue of 300,000, and we had 12 radio stations, and that was in 2009. This year, our revenue will be 2.1 million. We are going to be going from 4 to 6 full-time with 1 part-time, and we have about 27 contractors. And we have 18 stations. So we're
Wow. That
little,
is
little bit of growth.
Little bit of growth in 15 years. It's pretty impressive. And I mean, just sort of to let people in behind the curtain, and I think it sort of speaks to the kind of CEO that you are. As you and I are speaking, it is day 2 of the fair, and obviously this isn't going to run until towards the end of the fair. But you, for about 5 minutes, had to postpone our time to sit down and talk because you were going to have to go on the air because one of your employees was going to be unfortunately unable to be at the broadcasting at the fair, so you were going to.
Yeah, so actually, I will be there for tomorrow. I'll be staffing our booth tomorrow. I will be staffing the booth on Saturday, excuse me, on Sunday, and on Tuesday. I joke that I am not an ivory tower manager. We are a small enough organization. Not only do I work shifts at the state fair, we set up on Sunday. I was there 8 hours. You will find me under a table helping to tape down wires so that nobody trips. You'll find me carrying our CDs into the storage area and helping to set it up. I'm just a believer that I don't want to be asking our employees to be doing things that I'm not going to do myself. The only situation today, it was because it was actually a contractor. It's mostly staff who staff our booth, but I did have a contractor, and she had a sick child, and said, "Well, I think I can get there by 4." Even with my sick child. And I said, "No, we're just going to take you off today. We'll get," and I was going to go out there, but I forgot. I just, for a brief moment, because I went into fixed mode and went, "I'm going out there." And then, because I looked at the schedule and I went, "Oh, I have one other contractor. Let me reach her and see if she can." And she was like, "Oh, well, was just going to clean house today. So yeah, I could do that instead." And I'm like, "Okay, well, I can keep our interview."
Well, I mean, I would think going on the radio sounds a lot more fun than cleaning house too, from her perspective.
Probably a little bit.
So you mentioned you weren't ready when you were in Kansas City. You weren't ready to come home yet. Home is St. Paul.
Home is St. Paul. Yep, I was born. So yes, thank you for saying St. Paul, because I am very quick to say yes, I was born in St. Paul. I am not a Minneapolis kid. I grew up in the Highland Park area of St. Paul. When I left in '88 for the University of Missouri, I did not return home again until 2002. So was gone for quite a while, and then came back in '02 to Egan, and moved back to Highland about 5 years ago. So truly back home.
Yeah, I would think that probably plenty has changed, and also not very much has changed in Highland between '88 and '02.
Agreed, but I will also say, it's interesting because people talk about how welcoming Minnesota is, and Minnesota nice, and I'll tell you, even just having been gone that long, I mean, you still, I mean, I obviously have my family here, but I have a small family, and you still had to break back into the community. The community is pretty. It's more of a tight knit community. And,
absolutely.
It was interesting moving around because I mentioned the challenge in Birmingham, even in the Jewish community, where all they cared about was how much I was going to pay to be Jews of the synagogue, even though I was like, oh, I can. I'd like to chaperone youth activities. So I was right out of college and do the only committee I heard from was dues and how much the dues were going to be. And then I went to Peoria, and they were like, "Oh, we're going to pay to send you and your wife to this young leadership conference, and we want." And I had, an invitation to Shabbat dinner within 48 hours of arriving there, and so it's interesting to see the reception in the different communities.
Yeah, it's I'm a little surprised. Figured, Southern hospitality is another expression people people in the South at least are fond of saying, but I mean, at least the Jewish community has gone over, had a bit of a makeover, I should say, since that time, and synagogue dues and how synagogues approach that sort of thing has evolved.
Yeah, I would, it was, so I was there in 93, and just real quickly, because it's just still amazes me that I can tell this story, that it was in my lifetime. So there was an interracial couple that was going to go to prom in Wedowee, Alabama. And the principal said, no, you can't go. And so they went to the ACLU and got the ACLU involved, and the ACLU said, you have to allow them. I think they actually technically got an injunction, and the principal said, I'm not allowing it, I'm canceling prom.
Yeah.
And so then the next escalation, which is just completely logical, is then somebody burned the school down. And then I sent a photographer to go cover it, who got beat up, and there were bomb threats on the TV station. So, and this was in 1993. This was not 1967. This was 1993. And I had to, the newsroom was primarily transplants. So it was a very different philosophy, and I don't share my political views, especially because I have to do a lot of lobbying
Sure.
but I still, there's still human rights aspects. And the other part that I remember is there was a local person, and when news is moving fast, and you're on deadline, language isn't always the best. And I did use somebody else's Lord's name in vain, and it was inappropriate. And somebody called me out on it and said, you did that, and you did that on a Sunday. And I said, you're right. And you know what? I'm really sorry. I'll tell you what, you stop telling me that the N words and the F words should be hung or shot, and I'll be careful on what I say around you. And that's different. You can't make that. I said, yes, I can. And this conversation is over. Goodbye.
Yeah.
So yeah. So So I spent a year in Birmingham, and I'm glad I did. It was an experience, but I'm also glad I don't live there anymore.
For sure. So I'm curious, how do your Jewish upbringing and your sort of the Jewish community you came from in St. Paul sort of inform how you look at both sort of news and journalism as you're coming up in the business, and now sort of management and leadership now that you're in this role?
It's interesting because one of the projects that I am working on right now, we just got a $1.25 million grant to launch diverse news. And it was something that I had been working on for a very long time. It came about because KMOJ came to me after George Floyd and said, this is an international story in our backyard, and we're not covering it because we don't have the resources. And if we're not going to cover it right, we're not going to cover it at all. Is there something Ampers can do to help? Can you guys help us raise the funds to to get a newsroom again? And I was like, unfortunately, I can't, for one, because I can't do it for you. And KFAI got rid of their newsroom, and so many lost their newsroom. And but what if we created a joint news department and didn't compete? There's plenty of news out there. We're not going to compete with NPR and KCP because it already exists. So that's already there.
Yep.
So what if instead we bring diverse perspectives and stories and voices that aren't already being covered and aren't already being shared? And I think this is not like my twisting your question into a sales pitch, because where I the reason I went down that path is I can remember like having to kind of check my pro-Israel values in as a journalist, and really have to look and see, am I truly being non-biased? I have to remember the fact that I am Jewish. I have to remember that I am in general pro-Israel, and I cannot let that color when I am helping to either write or edit or supervise this script, because we would do international stories, and so and I do look at the media and where the media has gone now, and don't get me started on, I mean, the fact that, and try to find an unbiased news source, good luck. But our hope is that we are going to be telling stories from BIPOC communities and a BIPOC perspective, and from the LGBTQ, and from those living with a disability in greater Minnesota, and from their perspective and in their own voices, and kind of a nothing about us without us. And I think that really did come from the upbringing of the values, and let us tell our own stories and stop having everybody else tell them for us, and from the dominant, because we are not a part of the dominant culture. I mean, the shift from Christmas to the holidays, back to Christmas again. I mean, and all of that, I mean, that interweaves into media tremendously.
No, it absolutely does. And I think, yeah, it was sort of a twist on the question, but I think it's an important way of looking at it too, though. And I think the stations you're working with and the communities you're working with, that, I mean, I think that's how you build a diverse audience, is to, basically speak directly to those communities and the needs of them.
And I think, the deep Jewish, for me, the biggest Jewish value that I take away in Judaism, period, is trying to make the world a better place here and now. I mean, that's the bottom line for me. That is, when I look at now there are many, but to me, what matters the most, and it's because it's our responsibility to make the world a better place, not because of heaven or hell or anything, but it's our responsibility to make the world a better place. And so what I look at is, what can I do in my career to make the world a better place? And so the Jewish values that I'm bringing, I'm looking at, well, one of the things that I can do is to bring voices that are marginalized or absent, and help to amplify and help to bring out these stories that aren't out there. And so, I mean, I think that's probably a more direct answer to the question, is of how do I bring that. That I would say is the more direct way, is I'm looking and saying, these communities are not being represented accurately and in their own manner, and here I have an opportunity and a chance to do that. And so I think that's probably more directly in the way. Right now we've been doing it with things like Minnesota Native News, and we've been doing it with Native Lights and Veterans Voices and things like that, and we did it by covering the Derek Chauvin trial, which completely from BIPOC reporters and producers. It actually got international attention when we did that. And that was kind of the beta for this diverse news concept. And it's daunting to think about launching it, but it's at the same time incredibly exciting, and an opportunity to really to make a difference, hopefully.
I mean, I certainly hope so, and it certainly seems like you are well on your way to doing that. Well, Joel, last couple questions, and we will let you get back to preparations for staffing the booth at the state fair. First, what is your favorite Jewish holiday?
Oh, favorite Jewish holiday. You didn't tell me I had to be prepared for that one.
These are the two I always end with, and they often stump people more than the rest of the interview.
Oh, by far. The other stuff was super easy. What I love about Jewish holidays is bringing the family together, and so many of them bring the family together. So I don't do it and haven't done it for a couple of years, but and I'm gonna I believe it falls on Rosh Hashanah, not on Yom Kippur. Yeah, it's got to be on Rosh Hashanah. Tashlich, when you go down to the river, and it to me is really, I love being with family, but the idea of actually giving thought to that time period of repentance and what did you do, and instead of that, maybe you think about it in the synagogue, but and so for me, if you're actually down at the river, it's not technically, it's a sub part of a holiday, but I'm going to go with the Tashlich service of Rosh Hashanah.
That is, I don't believe in 37 episodes of this now, somebody has gotten quite so granular in Rosh Hashanah, but I like that. I can appreciate that response. And finally, what is your favorite Jewish food?
Okay, so I'm going to have to say, even though my stomach will disagree, latkes.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have the Jewish stomach that does not like the grease.
Nope.
But you gotta love a good latke. Matbol soup is going to be a close second, but I think latke's got to be number one.
Applesauce or sour cream?
Both. Combo. Mix them up, put it on.
Oh, mix them and put them on. Okay.
Mix them up and put them on.
Okay. Interesting.
Nah, it can't be separate.
I've had people say that they want them both, but not together. Like
you mix it up, put it on as a topping. Oh yeah, all together.
Wild. All right. Well, Joel Glaser, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate the time and loved learning about Ampers and the radio group you are managing, and wish you the best of luck going forward. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me on. Thank you for doing what you do.
The Who the Folk podcast is part of the Jewfolk Podcast Network, a product of Jewfolk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.